It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on Current Initiatives. And now, to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
I have Rachel Rudolph, PhD. She's an assistant professor. She's an extension vegetable specialist. This is under the Department of Horticulture at University of Kentucky. So we're going to talk about her work there and possibly talk about Hightunnels and vegetable crop production. So, Rachel, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, no problem. Tell me a bit about your background and how you got into this area. And then I want to ask you about what you're working on right now.
Yeah, so, I think I'd always been really into the environment, kind of, worried about recycling and pollution and that kind of thing, even as a little kid. And then as I got into college, I learned more about the local food movement and got interested in that. And then after college and right at the tail end of college, I guess I was just starting to become interested in plant science. And then I went into the Peace Corps and I started working with farm families and gardening and just kind of like my first experience into extension work, even though, I didn't think about it like that at the time. And I came back to the U.S. after completing my time in the Peace Corps in Paraguay and just, I really liked working with plants and I really liked working with people. And, agriculture is plants and people. A lot of it, sometimes there's livestock. So, and that's where horticulture came in and I just went from there.
Well, quick question. What is horticulture versus agriculture versus aquaculture versus viticulture versus permaculture versus, there's like 8 million cultures. So, some of these terms seem interchangeable, but like, for instance, horticulture versus agriculture. What's the difference?
So I would say horticulture is underneath agriculture, right? It's like a branch of agriculture, just like equine science would be a branch of agriculture, right? Just like aquaculture would be a branch of agriculture. So the agriculture is like the broad term, right? And then we've got all these like subclasses. And that's honestly one of the things so I'm in horticulture, right? And it is, I think very broadly defined as the art or practice of garden cultivation and management, right? Like when you Google that, that's what comes up. But it's basically, plant cultivation. And usually that always means fruit, vegetables, ornamentals, nuts, those kind of, usually horticultural crops are usually the things that don't necessarily need to be processed to be consumed in that sense, right? Vegetables and fruit, most of them, unlike a lot of agronomic crops, we don't need to process them to enjoy them. And so that's another way to kind of look at it.
Okay.
Sometimes turf grass is also thrown in with horticulture, but sometimes it's not. So it can kind of be a broad category for a lot of things.
Okay, gotcha. So what are some of the projects that you're working on right now at University of Kentucky?
Yeah, so my lab specifically, big thing right now is working with root knot nematodes. So root knot nematodes, a microscopic plant parasitic organism. It looks basically like a microscopic worm. It is a microscopic worm, and it resides in the soil and it infects plant roots and can cause a lot of damage and yield decline and in some cases crop death. And so we've been looking at that kind of across Kentucky. Where is it? What species are we looking at? What species are growers dealing with? And also grower awareness. So do they know they've got this? Do they know how to manage it? What management practices are they using? Those kind of things. And then, kind of piggybacking off of that is we've been doing a lot of on-farm experiments with growers, trying different methods to manage root knot nematode, one of which is using grafted tomatoes that are resistant to root knot nematode and kind of evaluating them against non-resistant varieties that growers are commonly using.
Okay. What are nematodes are essentially what? Like microscopic worms or?
Yeah, they're microscopic
do?
worms. They're not like earthworms, right? They're non-segmented and they feed. So they've got a stylet that helps them feed off of plant roots. So they basically slowly take nutrients away from plants. Some of them invade plant roots and lay eggs in plant roots. So it's kind of, and they can produce really quickly. And so one plant parasitic nematode can quickly become 500, right, in very short time.
Okay. Do the plants have any defenses against them? How do you know if nematodes are attacking?
Right.
What's observable?
Yeah, so some plants do have natural resistance. Some are naturally just non-hosts, right? So the plant parasitic nematode cannot infect and cannot reproduce in the presence of this plant, right? It's just a genetic component to it. Other plants have kind of an antagonistic qualities. So, for example, mustard crops have produced glucosinolates, and when you chop up a mustard plant, right, you get this volatile gas that has suppressive qualities to it that can basically antagonize and suppress nematode populations. So those are kind of two different. So the mustard itself, if you don't chop it up, right, that mustard plant could be a host for root knot nematode or plant parasitic nematodes in general. But when you've chopped it up, you've created this chemical compound that suppresses them. So that's a really interesting component. And so, yeah, plants in general, there's kind of a spectrum of non-hosts, and then you've got resistant plants that may allow some reproduction to occur or some feeding to occur from the plant parasite, but fairly low. And then you've got susceptible plants, right, that of course allow reproduction, infection, feeding, all that kind of thing. And so, and then kind of in that spectrum, you've also got tolerant plants, which we find we're kind of discovering this. They still produce pretty high yields. We've got in one of our projects, right, this particular variety, that we looked at, it produced very high yields comparable to some of the other treatments, but it also allowed for pretty high infection rates, root knot nematode. So, right, I would classify that more as tolerant because you're not managing the population very well, but you're still producing pretty decent yields. So from a grower's perspective, if you're just looking at the above ground, qualities, the grower may think they're doing really well because they've got decent yield.
So, okay, what happens to plants when they're under nematode attack? Like how would a grower know that what's going on? Or how would it figure out?
So in this particular, for root knot nematode specifically, the above ground symptoms can be kind of hard to see, hard to decipher. So the plant may start to kind of look yellow, starts lower in the leaves. As the symptoms, as the infection progresses, the plant will start to look necrotic. So the leaves will start to die and turn brown, and you'll have lower yield, right? But if you're not really paying attention, you may chalk this up to nutrient deficiency. You may not notice that it's, a lot of growers wouldn't necessarily know it's root knot nematode. And if you're not really calculating or taking notes on your yield from year to year, you may not notice this decline in yield over the course of several years. It may take a little while. So the above ground symptoms are kind of hard to notice, as it can kind of look like a lot of different things. But if you pull up the plant roots, most of the time you will see galling. So the roots look knotted and gnarled, and that is a plant response to root knot nematode infection. So that's kind of the telltale sign of a root knot nematode infection, is pulling up those plant roots and seeing that galling. And that's why it's called root knot nematode, right? There's knots on the roots.
What is so galling is the appearance of these knots, and they're not root nodules, right?
Yes. Yeah. They're not nodules in the sense of, we think of nodules as a good thing, right? Like nitrogen fixation. They kind of look like that, honestly. But, tomatoes don't fix nitrogen in that way, right? So that would be a clear indication if you pulled up a tomato plant and saw this, right? That would be, it can kind of, the galls or the knots can vary in size, right? From small, like a BB size to, the size of a quarter. And it's pretty big. Yeah.
Does anything live inside these, I guess, I don't know if you call them nodules or what would you call them, but do bacteria take up residence, or fungi, or what happens? Do they contain the eggs of the nematodes, or are they houses for nematodes? What happens?
Right. So the kind of certain with root knots, they're sedentary endoparasites. So that means they enter the roots and they lay eggs, and then those eggs hatch and they go on to infect other roots, right? And so the knots themselves are really more of a plant response to this infection. And then other nematodes other types of plant parasites they're migratory endoparasites. And so they kind of move in and out much more quickly. And then there is the ectoparasites. So they will only stay on the outside of the root and feed. But this feeding, they're basically creating wounds in the plant roots, and that can lead to other infection by other, soil-borne pathogens, right? So that is an additional complication to the whole thing, right? It's, you've cut yourself on a, piece of glass, and then something else gets in your wound, right? And it kind of can spiral from there.
But has anyone done like biopsies in cross sections of these, these nematode constructed bumps to see again, is there any underlying structure, or again, other organisms?
Right. Yes, there are lots. Yeah, I totally encourage people to, Google root knot nematode galls, right?
Maybe it's creating like a localized, pathogenic microbiome around the roots, which also affects the plants. I don't know what it houses, or again, the structure.
Right. It's basically, they make these large cells. So it's kind of, again, to my knowledge, there's no like pathogen in the gall. It's just like a huge cell. And again, it's a plant response from this feeding. It's not necessarily anything's in that gall, but it does inhibit the plant's ability to take up nutrients and take up water. And that is where, that's where the problem then shows itself above ground, right? The plant starts to wilt, the plant starts to turn yellow, the plant starts to turn brown, because it can't take, no matter how much you irrigate, no matter how much you fertilize, it cannot take up that nutrient solution.
Why? What's happening to the roots? Are they, is this nodule like going into the center of the root, so literally nothing can flow past it? Is it sitting on the outside edge of the root, but it's somehow like putting tendrils into the root and compromising it? Like why do you think mechanistically it compromises root function?
So the again, it's not a nodule. This gall is really just inhibiting. It's changed the root morphology. So it's basically just inhibiting the plant's ability to take up water as it naturally would, right? And so I totally encourage people to Google, right, root knot nematode damage to plants, and you can see usually when you Google them, you'll see like a healthy root next to a damaged root. And you can kind of see how, knotted and different it is. And as far as genetically, what is happening in there, I couldn't answer that question for you. But it is changing the shape of the root and changing the root's ability to, take up water and nutrients.
But we can't tell, again, mechanistically how they do it. Is it obvious or is it not understood?
No, people know. I just don't know.
Okay. So what is some of it, obviously you deal with it. Which plants seem to be most susceptible to this, and what can a grower do to try to, reduce the nematodes or get rid of them?
So as I said, there's resistant crops that they can utilize to suppress the population. You can do nematicides, soil fumigant, solarization, soil solarization. Basically, no one method is going to solve the problem. There's no eradication of root knot nematode or of plant parasitic nematodes. You can, drive the population down and then manage it from there. But once it's there, they're there. So, and they can be very deep in the soil. And so it is really hard to, you can't get every last one.
How do nematodes move through the soil? Like, how do they get to the roots in the first place? Are the eggs near the roots and they're just spawning locally and then worming their way around to the right spot, or how do they navigate, you think?
Yeah. So nematodes themselves don't move too much by themselves, right? So they don't move very far. A lot of it is us, moving soil around, which is really common in agriculture, right? You're weeding, you're tilling, you're plowing, right? And soil kind of gets turned over and gets moved around. So that's kind of the large movement can happen through there. They can also, get moved a little bit through water, but they're also drawn to the roots. Like the root exudates, right? I would say there's a response there. And so they're kind of drawn just naturally to the roots from the exudates. And so they know where they're going, right? They sense that there's a host there.
Do the nematodes have a life cycle where they go through different forms, or they just stay nematodes the whole time? And
there's a life cycle. So for root knot nematode, there is 5 stages. So that would be, you go from egg. So the female hatchet lays about 500 eggs at one time. The eggs can overwinter. So they can survive in the soil for quite a long time. If it's, cool, then they may just hang out as is. The J2 is the infective stage. So that's basically the second juvenile phase. And that's when they look like a worm, right? So that's when they first look like a worm. J1, J2, they can start infecting roots. They move into the roots, they infect them. J3, J4, those are just later juvenile phases that people don't focus very much on. A lot of what we focus on is that infective stage. And then that juvenile will either turn into a female and can, produce eggs on their own, or a male. And so it goes like that. And so the females are kind of globular shaped. The adult females look very round. They don't look like a worm per se. The adult males do.
Do they have a seasonality of appearance? Do they tend to go away in the winter and come in the growing season, or what do they do?
So they're active in the warmer, when soil temperatures are warmer. So somewhere between, 20 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius, that's kind of their active, that's their peak time of activity. So in the winter, typically, right, the soil is much cooler and they're there, but they're not active.
Okay. What happens if you're using season extenders like greenhouses, high tunnels?
Yeah.
If you have thermal masses inside those, like what does that do to the nematodes? Do they still go away at the same time, or now they stick around?
Yeah, so that's been something my lab has been working on, is this we've been focused on high tunnels because, so a high tunnel is a passively heated and cooled structure. It's kind of like a greenhouse, except there's not temperature control per se. There's kind of temperature management, right? And it's just protected agriculture. And people normally are growing in the soil in a high tunnel versus in a greenhouse, they're probably using potting soil, right? Soil is media. And so in a high tunnel, there's a lot, because of that, it's a warmer environment than it is outside. We suspect that root knot nematode can get going, right, a lot quicker, right? Because the soil temperatures are warmer earlier in the season than they normally would be out in the open field. So that's one effect. You're also, because you have this structure, you can produce for longer because of these nice warm temperatures. There's a host crop in that high tunnel for longer than there normally would be outdoors, right? So then this nematode also has a host for, maybe all year long. I mean, you can produce in a high tunnel all year long. And so you've also given them a host for most of the year. And so that also will affect reproduction and, the population density of root knot nematode overall. Yeah.
Okay. Any other, I'm sure there's plenty of others, but any other major projects that you're working on that, you're making some headway in, where in terms of understanding, where a lot of people don't understand what you're looking at, or are you doing more optimization type thing on the gardens that you're in control of, or what's your work like?
So yeah, we're also doing soil solarization. So looking at what temperatures we can reach in the soil, and soil solarization has the potential to really be valuable for a lot of growers. They don't have to, it's organic or conventional. You don't have to, there's no chemical applications. Small scale growers can implement this. Large scale growers can implement this. So it has a lot of flexibility there. And it has the potential to be beneficial at managing a really wide range of issues. So not only root knot nematode, but soil-borne diseases, right? Weeds, right? So that it's just could be something that could be really valuable for growers. And it's not necessarily a new thing in general, but it hasn't really been evaluated here in Kentucky at our latitude. And so we're looking at what temperatures can we reach at different soil depths at what times of the year. So we're looking at that, and we've got some really exciting, interesting preliminary data on that.
What's your goal?
Well, so it really depends
down
on,
or up, or
it really depends on what the target for people is, right? So for example, sclerotinia, that is a soil-borne disease that is usually can be suppressed or killed at about 40 degrees Celsius, right? So that our goal for if someone's targeting that on their farm, right, you'd want to hit that temperature. And you'd also want to hit it probably at least, 4 to 6 inches into the soil profile. So if you can get 2 inches into the soil, deep into the soil, that's great. But ideally you'd want to go, you'd want to reach that temperature even lower just to make sure that you've covered your bases. Root knot nematode, based off of our work, I suspect can be suppressed or killed at a lower temperature. So more in the, maybe 37, 38 degrees Celsius range would be suitable. But they, as I said earlier, they can go even lower in the soil profile. They can be found even deeper in the soil profile. So you'd want to hit those temperatures even deeper than 6 inches, right? 8, 12 inches, that would be great.
Well, what about cover crops? I've seen that they'll significantly reduce the soil temperature. I don't know down to what depth, but do you utilize those? And if you combine that with, let's say, mustard greens, to kick the nematodes' asses, that come there. Would that be a good combination, maybe for multiple reasons?
So are you talking about cover crops of reducing soil temperature in what way?
Well, so there's not bare ground. So supposedly, certain cover crops not only will produce nitrogen for certain plants that don't fix it, but
Right.
from what I've read, maybe I'm wrong, certain ones will substantially reduce soil temperature because, again, it's not bare ground.
Right. So it's providing kind of a shade for the soil. So yeah, that is an option. I'm not sure so the timing of when the cover crop would be produced and then when the nematode would be active, it may not coincide perfectly, but certainly cover crops could be utilized as a non-host or as biofumigation, which I described briefly earlier. I think those would be two really viable options, or potentially incorporating and tarping, right, with a clear plastic similar to soil solarization, right? And so you could kind of maybe do double duty there with biofumigation and soil solarization.
Okay, very good. Rachel, what's the best way for people to learn more about the work you're doing? It sounds like you're doing some, researching some very unusual things. Again, where can they go to find out more about your work?
So we've got a website, vegcrops.ca.uky.edu. That's our lab website. We're also on Instagram, UKY VegCrops. You can find us on Facebook, similar title. We have a great YouTube channel if people are looking to, learn more and just want to zone out and watch some videos. So that would be Kentucky Vegetable Crop Extension and Research. There's a lot of ways to find us.
Okay, well, very good. Well, Rachel, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are one or two useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.